Welcome to the February 13th, 2025 episode of The Energy Show. I'm energy journalist Markham Hislop, and I'm joined by my co-host, our show producer, MC Breadner.
Everyone.
I've got this great interview that I did earlier today with Professor Amy Janzwood, and she is the McGill University Bieler School of Environment a professor. Her research includes politics of energy and the environment, and she wrote an op-ed in the Globe and Mail today called "Let's Not Get Too Excited About Pipelines. Canadians Can't Afford Another." Got to read it. It's a good piece, and we're going to talk about that. But before we do, MC and I are going to go over a poll that came out. Angus Reid released it a couple days ago, and we're just going to show a couple of slides in this because I don't know. You'll see when we get this up. MC, if you could put the slide up, that'd be great. Okay, this is the poll was about pipeline possibilities in wake of Trump tariff threats. Majority support Energy East and Northern Gateway. Well, Energy East, Northern Gateway was canceled by the government in 2016, in a large part because the company did such a poor job of consulting with Indigenous communities and Aboriginal people, which they are required in the Constitution to do. They did a really bad job. In fact, one of the VPs actually had to publicly apologize for what a bad job they did. So it got canceled. Energy East was always a suspect. It was a weak project. And when Keystone XL was reapproved by Donald Trump 1.0, then the proponent TC Energy decided that they would put their efforts into KXL instead of Energy East. Okay, now we're talking about bringing them back. So what this poll does, look at these numbers. 2019, support for Energy is 58%, 65%, and small numbers opposed. And now if we can just get the next slide up there. Look at how these break down, oddly enough. The Conservative Party, the CPC, very big numbers in support of these. And then in the middle, the Liberals, 67, 45, 64, 41. Those are the two leaders, Mark Carney and Christian Freeland, who are running for the leadership, and whoever wins will become the prime minister. That's the way the Canadian system works. And then you've got the New Democrats, the left-leaning party, and the BQ, which is kind of left-leaning. So basically, it's broken down by partisanship. And here's the point I want to make. In I don't know, 2018, 2019, there was a poll that came out about the National Energy Board. And it was in the news all the time because of these very pipelines. And they asked the Canadians, they said, do you think the NEB is doing a good job? And a very large majority said, oh, yeah, no, we think it's a great job. We're doing. And then the next question they asked was, what do you know about the activities? Do you know what the NEB actually does? And like 85% of them knew nothing.
Yeah.
They did, and why would they? If you're regulating uh, cross, it's called interprovincial, so it's across provincial borders or international borders for pipelines, for electricity transmission, that sort of thing. It's a very technical, complex work. Why would anybody outside of, engineers and, companies and so on know any of that stuff? Well, of course they don't. And it's exactly the same thing here. And we really, we need to, this got a lot of play in the media. That's why I'm bringing it up, is we shouldn't pay any attention to this. It is literally meaningless. And who cares if a large majority of people support these two pipeline projects? We don't do pipeline projects or any other kind of large scale infrastructure just because people like it and they approve it. So anyway, I don't know, MC, what are you seeing on social media and in your network about, you know, this issue?
Yeah, I mean exactly that. I mean these these surveys are created to kind of elicit a certain answer, can I say? And I don't think that they were presented with any alternatives. We were just talking about certain pipeline projects. So I mean I find that kind of interesting. But yeah, the media today is just all over this story and thinking about Canadians. wanting actually to get these pipeline projects going. So
Well, and you brought up a really good point, which was what if the people had been asked about alternatives? What if they had been
yeah,
told, hey, recent studies show that up to 300,000 barrels a day of extra oil pipeline shipping capacity could be added simply by optimizing the Trans Mountain expansion pipeline to the West Coast. 300,000 barrels. What would they have said to that? And then if you told them there's another 650,000 barrels a day of capacity that could be added in the American pipelines simply through optimization, would they then have done the math and gone, hey, hang on a second, that's 950,000 barrels a day. That's like two Northern Gateway pipelines. Why would we approve two new pipelines when we have that much capacity sitting there that we can add into the existing pipelines? So if you don't give the people who are responding to these surveys an option, they'll let them know that there's an alternative. Of course, you're going to get the answer you want.
yeah. Well, and I mean, I don't even know unless you're really into it, if you could even contextualize how many millions of barrels, what's the total market? How many, what's the capacity increase? Like there's so many questions that I don't think the average person is thinking about. So yeah, I think these polls are pretty leading, if you ask me.
And this is an issue that Dr. Janzwood and I talked about because the conversation around pipelines in Canada is so dominated by incumbents and it's so dominated by the industry narrative machine. And this poll is one of the ways in which that narrative machine, it's industry associations, it's supposedly independent groups like the Resource Works in Vancouver and the MacDonald Laurier in Institute in Montreal, and they're supposedly independent think tanks, and on and on. I mean, there's this army, a bloody army of oil and gas uh, organizations and groups that immediately rush into the public, rush into the media, and start promoting these things just like on cue. It's just odd, isn't it? It happens. So anyway, we wanted to point out, going into this interview with Dr. Janzwood, that this is an example of how the incumbents use manipulate the energy conversation to get the outcomes that they want. And in fact, what we need, as we've been saying here all along, is we need a more fulsome, a bigger, a more complex kind of energy conversation so that we can be better informed to make strategic decisions or support strategic decisions about energy in Canada. So I would encourage you, if you got this far in the show, please watch the interview with Dr. Janzwood. I really enjoyed it and I think you will too. Amy, I'm really glad to have you here today because your op-ed about pipelines in Canada is very, very timely. And it follows an interview we did a couple days ago. In fact, yesterday we ran the show with uh, an interview, clips from an interview with Kevin Byrne, the energy economist with S&P Global. And in it, he said, Canadians need to be more strategic about determining like Canada's oil and gas interests and interests in exports. So that raises the questions, are more pipelines in Canada's best interests? And your column or your op-ed argues that no, it's not. So maybe just give us an overview of your argument, please.
Sure. Thanks, Markham. It's great to be here, and I'm so glad to see all the conversations that you've been having, continuing to have with folks across the country. So, in short, I argue that simply Canadians cannot afford another pipeline, and I give a bit of a historical review of some key mega oil pipeline projects and talked about the reasons why they haven't been built. And I make the argument that I believe raise this point as well. We need to be paying attention to who is talking about building new mega oil sands pipelines. And it is one group only, right? Those are our political leaders. It is not the pipeline industry. Some folks might be surprised to hear that. It really comes down to politicians talking about pipelines as a kind of easy fix, although we can get into lots of reasons why it's neither easy nor a fix. But it's really important to remark, as you've done, that this is not the pipeline industry asking for more pipelines. In fact, this is a very political conversation. And so I make the argument that it's really not commercially or economically feasible right now to be talking about building new oil pipelines. And if there was somehow kind of wave a magic wand and things do change, the only real interest we've seen in terms of actually getting pipelines built is when governments buy pipeline companies and try to do it themselves. That's also another story, which happy to talk about. But in short, I argue that that's essentially the only way we're going to get another oil pipeline built. And looking at Trans Mountain expansion, which we as taxpayers are on the hook for, at least 34 billion. I don't know that the final numbers have actually been released, but there's enormous costs. And so in short, I make the argument that we shouldn't be on the hook for another pipeline. We aren't able to afford it.
Yeah, it's not even clear that the pipeline tolls, the fee that producers get charged per barrel, would even cover the debt that was required to build Trans Mountain expansion. That's a very convenient little fact that's been hinted at in a couple of news stories, but doesn't get much of a discussion. We don't know the answer to it yet. One of the things that, and I should point out, Kevin Burns said very clearly, Canada now has a reputation as someplace that can't build infrastructure, deserved or undeserved, doesn't matter. He said because of that reputation, there will a new pipeline would absolutely require public capital, taxpayers' dollars to get built. There's no way to avoid risking our tax money if a pipeline gets built.
Yeah, I think we can have a conversation about the challenges to building mega infrastructure. I would have maybe a few things to say about that in terms of the history of why it is that we've had a hard time getting mega oil sands and mega oil pipeline projects built. But it's certainly the case that the government should not be in the business of buying pipeline companies. The last time I checked, we don't have that kind of expertise, nor I think the financial cost benefit calculation is one that is quite interesting in terms of how the government ended up ultimately buying the Trans Mountain expansion project, not knowing ultimately how much it was going to cost, and recognizing that investors from the Trans Mountain expansion project were really sort of skipping away from the sale when they were able to offload it to the federal government. There's a lot of financial questions, in terms of when or if the project would be offloaded or sold. I don't even know that sold is actually the correct term, because there's lots of analysis that show that the government is very unlikely to recoup its costs. And so anyway, all of this to say, a lot of the political discourse lately has been, we needed the Trans Mountain expansion. Thank goodness we have it, given the threats in the US around tariffs. And, it is a very convenient argument that is a bit divorced from the reality that there are oil shippers, big oil companies that are shipping on this expansion that are fighting very hard to not have the tolls, come down the line. It just doesn't, make economic sense for them. And whether or not taxpayers are going to be able to absorb those costs is a really important question, and not one that we have frankly had enough conversation about in this country.
Well, let's talk. You asked the question in your op-ed, if pipeline companies have moved on, why haven't our politicians? And I will tell you about an interview I did with Bill Whitelaw, who's a longtime energy journalist in Calgary. And he wrote a column about we need to tell our story better. The oil and gas industry needs better narratives. We're just so bad, he said, at telling our stories. Baloney. The oil and gas industry in Canada has the biggest narrative machine you have ever seen. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of organizations that are dedicated to promoting oil and gas and pipelines and so on across the country. They spend tens of millions of dollars every year lobbying politicians, both at the federal level and the provincial level. The national media runs their stuff all the time. They have their own organs. I mean, Heather Exner-Poirot at the VP of Donald Laurier Institute, Stuart Muir at ResourceWorks, Brett Wilson, who's retired oil guy, but has a big on and on. There's dozens of these, hundreds of these people. The oil and gas industry has a huge voice. Those who raise questions about it and are not necessarily anti-oil and gas have a very tiny voice. And I know because I'm part of that tiny voice. And it is frustrating. Anyway, I've gone on a little bit, but is that sort of how you see it?
Yeah, I think the history of oil developments and mega oil pipelines is fascinating. I do think the industry developed a bit of a victim complex because they were so surprised at the kinds of opposition that they were seeing that they were not expecting. They were definitely, I think, caught on their back foot. And I think as a result, actually, the enormous PR machine and the kinds of funding and fundraising and citizens groups that they fund and support and political events and all of these things that we know well that the oil industry does. A lot of that actually was a response to the fact that they were not able to build pipelines in the way that they had envisioned back in 2008 when oil prices were at a record high. So I do think this is the narrative that the industry does like to tell about itself. We're if only it were politicians, or only if it were the political regulatory process, or all of these things. But in fact, if we kind of turn back the clock and look back to the Harper government, they had about a decade there where they claimed that they were trying to make Canada an energy superpower, but it was really their bungling of consultation with Indigenous communities and nations along the corridor for Northern Gateway that really was the main reason why that project is not going ahead, among other things. So I think it's really, easy to say, it's this government or that government, or, we need to be telling our story. But in fact, if you, look at the history of these projects, it's often much more complex than the industry, will let on. And, certainly they do have the resources to tell their story, and they're doing that quite well.
Here's a point that Dr. Chris Bataille, who's an energy economist, Canadian energy economist, said on this show last week. He said, there's a not very well-known story in Canada where the oil sands in particular, but the industry in general, doesn't match supply with export capacity. What it does is it invests massively in increases to production, like in the oil sands, for example, which is, I think over the last 15 years doubled and is going to go up another 600,000 barrels a day by 2030. It expands that with not knowing necessarily if it's going to have all of the pipeline egress, and then it feels entitled to have that pipeline egress and goes on the offensive. And oh, poor us, if you would only give us more pipelines, we could do more production and bring more jobs and yada, yada, yada. But it really is that nobody ever sits down and act. And this is why we called yesterday for a national energy strategy. What is the opportunity, if there is one? Where is it? How do we match supply with pipeline capacity that's either existing or needs to be built? Or are there other alternatives? And we'll get into that in just a minute. But there's a very rational, evidence-based approach that you could take to this where you could make decisions and policymakers could make decisions. And that's not the way we do it in Canada.
No, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I think, the industry also would benefit from this in a sense that, looking at the case of, Energy East and Keystone XL, where it was the same pipeline company, they were trying to make decisions, based on the uncertainties around those projects, how and, which way that they were going to try to position themselves and strategize. And you have executives that are literally living in Ottawa, trying to convince the government and these things. But then at the end of the day, it was the fact that there was uncertainty about how many pipelines were going to get built and by whom. And at the end of the day, shippers are the oil, companies that are shipping these products are only able to commit, firmly, to a particular project at a particular time. And so, I do think having a more strategic approach and a national approach would be very beneficial. It's a major challenge, going back a few years when all these proposals were being developed, in some ways they were competing against each other, right? And so you had enormous opposition, on all kinds of fronts. You did have an industry with essentially unlimited resources to be proposing new projects. But it was really, unclear at the time, which of these would get built. And it was also quite clear that not all of them should be built in terms of, even the capacity of the industry in their wildest dreams. I don't think they could have filled all of those projects if they had built every single one that they had wanted. So you're absolutely right that the regulatory process, looks at these projects in a very atomized way. And it's even difficult to assess, in terms of what oil production will look like in the future, what are climate commitments, all these lots of big questions, right? The regulatory process is not designed to have these kind of fulsome conversations and is really designed to look at a project on project basis. And I think now we're seeing, some of the weaknesses of that approach, unfortunately.
You make the point there's no economic case for new pipelines. Simply doesn't exist. Let me add to that, because in the existing system that goes mostly from Alberta down into the US, there's currently, mostly on the Enbridge mainline, but in some other smaller pipelines, 650,000 barrels a day of new capacity that could be added by optimizing those pipelines. So, you're debottlenecking and you're putting in friction reduction, chemicals, that sort of thing. 650,000. There's another, we just saw the announcement earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, 200,000 to 300,000 barrels a day of new capacity from Trans Mountain expansion optimization. Then on top of that, Kevin Byrne and I were talking about partial upgrading. So that's where you take ultra heavy sour crude and you do a partial upgrade to medium crude or maybe heavy crude. So it flows in the pipeline without diluent. That could get you another 250,000 barrels a day. Add those all up, and essentially what you've got is about 1.1 million barrels a day of new capacity. That's 2 Northern Gateway projects without adding a single piece of pipe in the ground. Then on top of that, we're currently doing about 100,000 barrels a day of rail, and we have capacity to do 400,000. And on top of that, we have other opportunities like starting to turn bitumen into carbon fiber and other materials. When you look at all of these opportunities and others, and in the strategic context, why in the world would Canada build even one more pipeline without investigating these first and putting that into some kind of a national strategy? And this is the danger, is that the industry and its shills and voices and lobbyists and so on drown out rational conversation, meaningful consideration of alternatives, which are out there because it's in the industry's self-interest to do these things. Well, where's our self-interest?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And the industry is very smart. The pipeline executives have long realized that there are easier ways for them to continue to expand production and to move their product. They've known this for quite some time. 2014, I think, was the last year that there was a new major oil pipeline that was proposed, to our federal energy regulator, right? That's quite some time ago, right? So the industry has been doing this quietly, right? They have been expanding, they have been optimizing. There are lots of ways, as you suggest, that they can do this. So I think you're absolutely right that it just doesn't make any sense to be talking about new pipelines, and even very hard line. The pipeline industry itself is not talking about this. So I do think I'm honestly quite tired of talking about pipelines, and I'm sort of shocked when I see they're constantly making the headlines every day, and someone else is, some other politician is talking about why we need a pipeline and this is going to solve all of our answers. And I am just truly shocked that we're still having this conversation.
I would agree. Now, I want to raise another issue, and because this is shocking to me. And I've mentioned this before on this show and on my podcast. And that is here at Energy Media, we call ourselves energy journalists. We're really energy transition journalists. And so when you go up, when I talk to experts in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, and other places, they're very plugged into the radical transformation of the global energy system that's been going on since 2020 and is accelerating thanks to China and the electrification of its economy and others. That is rapidly gaining pace. And we have very credible organizations, even Kevin Burns to S&P Global, peak oil demand by 2030. That never, ever comes into the national conversation. It's shocking to me. And when I tell people this, like I tell the experts that I'm talking to, we never have this conversation in Canada. And they go, what? How, how can that be that Canada has exempted itself and just thinks that it's somehow exceptional that the energy transition is going to pass us by? How is that? And I think that's something that we need to put front and center in this discussion.
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad that you're doing this work, Markham, and especially it's been unfortunate. It's been politically impossible to have this conversation for lots of reasons, that you've talked about, in terms of Alberta politics, the way that popular politics have, and Albertan identity, and there are real concerns, right, about workers in this industry, and the viability, the volatility, the long term, what is the future, right, of this industry. And you've done a lot of work around this question. And so, even I think a lot of workers in Alberta as well are rightly concerned about the future of their industry. However, it's just been politically impossible. Politicians have really, kind of weaponized the rhetoric around, really this idea that, this is, our primary industry, and if we don't have it, we don't find ways to, double down, we are going to be in serious trouble. And in fact, it's really unfortunate. It's quite the converse is true, right? If we don't start thinking about ways to diversify and transform, we are going to be left behind. There are lots of analyses around the risk of stranded assets. What happens if Canada is not the country that we are the last ones producing a barrel of oil. But in starker terms, it is not about being the last country to produce a barrel of oil. Quite frankly, it's about shifting market trends, right? And Alberta oil, it is costly to produce. We know this, and there's enormous environmental costs as well. But in terms of just the competitive case for heavy oil, it's true that there are a few markets, that are we rely on, for this oil. But we've seen, in recent weeks, the kinds of volatility and what that brings. And so the answer, to my mind, is not finding ways to double down on production and talk about ways of doubling production when even the oil industry is not talking about that. Right. Oil sands production is slowing down. We have to have this conversation about how to diversify. And unfortunately, that's just not been politically possible right now.
One of the things that struck me, I've been interviewing Kevin Byrne for the better part of a decade, and he is an acknowledged expert on the economics of the oil sands and, in a broader sense, the global heavy crude industry. And he wrote a report, co-authored a report in two of them in 2018 that dealt with heavy crude in Canada and heavy crude market in the United States. And in those reports are things like, the breakdown of where the 10 million barrels a day of heavy crude refining capacity is. It's, 23% in Asia, 55% in the US, on and on and on. And then he broke it down in the U.S. by the various PAD regions, before there are 5 of them. Here's my point. We don't know what our competitive advantage is in any of those markets. Like, we don't know for certain that if we build another pipeline or we expand the pipeline to TMX, that we could take more market in Asia. Maybe we don't take more market. Maybe Saudi Arabia or Iran or somebody like that pushes us. We don't get into that market, or maybe China change, any number of different things. How does the industry and government decide to spend tens of billions of dollars without doing that kind of competitive analysis? And more importantly, because taxpayers' money is involved, sharing it with us. so that people who know this industry and, we can look at it and review it, check the math, check the assumptions, and have a conversation about it. No, it all gets done behind closed doors, and they're gambling with your money and my money and everybody else's money.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Markham. There have been a lot for a long time, right? Folks asking for transparency on how these decisions are being made. And, I know very well how pipelines are approved. And often it's, evidence that the oil industry provides for itself based on, the desires of oil producers, not based on there's a lot of conversations about the kinds of assumptions that are baked into models and the kinds of really quite frankly the different scenarios that we're looking at. And so we absolutely need to have more of this. For the first time, Canada's energy regulator has developed what it calls its net zero, scenario planning for oil production. And this was only very recently, and actually only after a lot of requests from, academics like myself saying we need to be able to have conversations. We need to be able to look at the data, have real analyses about what these different scenarios look like. And so I'm very grateful that they're starting to do this, but it's coming a little bit too late, in terms of having these conversations. We need to be able to use this to inform policymaking in a meaningful way.
Yeah, politicians are very eager to, and industry very eager to weaponize that modeling. One of the great eye-opening exercises for me, Amy, was the last couple of years I've read a lot of modeling. I've actually read OPEC's World Oil Outlook 2045 and 50, and the IEA's and Rystad and Bloomberg and on and on and on. And Dr. Bataille said this. He said every good modeler states their assumptions up front. And so you can go to the front of the study and they will say, here are our key assumptions, and it's assumptions about what road transportation oil demand will be in the global south versus the global, all of those kinds of things. And everybody has different assumptions, which is why the model comes out with different conclusions. But as a journalist, I can then go to those models, the assumptions, and I can say, how are those assumptions holding up based on the evidence that we're seeing now? Is which one is more accurate, or which one is more likely given the trends, the arc of the trends that we're seeing now? That's a fascinating exercise. And when you do it, you get an insight into the energy future for Canada and for Alberta in particular that's very different than the kind of rhetoric and the narrative that we hear in the news and from our politicians. And it's that kind of conversation with people like Kevin Byrne and Chris Bataille and Andrew Leach, and there are lots of them, people like yourself. That would be a fascinating evidence-based conversation that would do more to illuminate what we need to do than the current system we have.
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to see that. I think you're right. It's often become sort of a battle of the models, and I think a lot of industry folks, proponents benefit from the way in which they kind of use particular models, particular times. But I think it's doing this work, being on the ground and saying, look, this is the history of the industry. This is how we know things have gone. What is, as you say, the more likely scenario, right? And given all the risks of this more likely scenario, what kinds of conversations are we having? And I think you see an enormous mismatch there.
Well, Amy, thank you very much for this. I think there might be just the glimmer of a hope that we will have these kind of conversations, and maybe around a national energy strategy. But the voices, you and I are two of a number of voices. We need many more of them. And we need Canadians to demand better of their politicians, to not just rubber stamp what the oil lobbyists say when they go to, Victoria to talk to the BC government, or Ottawa to talk to the federal government, or in Quebec even, for crying out loud. We need a better conversation. We've been arguing this a long time in Energy Media. We need a better conversation around the future of energy. And thank you for your op-ed. I think you've made an interesting contribution to it.
Thanks so much, Markham. And hopefully I can be part of these conversations going forward. Thanks very much.